Hey everybody, my name is Ted Forbes. Welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. A lot has happened in the last week, and I want to talk about a couple things today that we're going to start with moving forward here. If you watch the podcast on iTunes, we did move servers this week, and it was a major headache, and it was a lot of pain, blood, sweat, and tears, but we got it done. If you're seeing this episode, you did everything right, you're subscribed to the new feed, and we're good to go. You will see this and all future new episodes. Now, the couple things I want to talk about, changes we're making with the show moving forward. First of all, one of the things I'm going to do is we're going to start scheduling the show on a regular basis. Over the summer, I've been kind of loose, and it's kind of been whenever. Sometimes we've done a couple of weeks. Sometimes we've gone a week without doing a show. I'm going to start putting the shows weekly, and we will release one every Thursday. And so every Thursday, you'll be able to jump on iTunes or YouTube or whatever, however you watch the show, and you'll be able to get new free content and a new episode on photography technique and philosophy or whatever it is we're talking about that day. But they will be released on Thursdays. And I picked Thursday because it's close enough to the weekend to where it's not lost in the fray, it's not too close to the weekend, and also it's during the week, so if you are at work and you find out there's a new episode, you can, remember to watch it over the weekend. So I think Thursday is going to be probably a good day for that. And so we're going to try that for a while, see how that works. So every Thursday you'll be able to get new content, which is pretty good. And the second thing I want to talk about in terms of that is because I did move hosting providers, I do have limits on what I can upload to the new provider. And it's a little bit problematic because this is show number 105, and there's a lot of shows and it's a lot of data to upload. And so for the time being, at least, if you want to watch older shows, and actually I'm going to reference two of them in today's show, if you want to watch older shows, you're going to need to do that one of two ways. You can go to our website for the show, which is theartofphotography.tv. I'll put the URL below. So theartofphotography.tv, where you can get a lot more information than what we cover in the podcast. You'll be able to see all the vlog episodes, all the archived proper Art of Photography episodes, etc. will be there. Or you could look at the YouTube channel, you could subscribe to that even, which is youtube.com/theartofphotography. So anyway, those are the two ways you'll be able to see older episodes. And I'm sorry, it's probably not convenient to some of you who are big iTunes users or use podcast apps or things like that, but that's how we're going to have to do it for now. So anyway, having said that, in the show notes I will reference two former episodes that we did today. And I will put those links in the show notes. And if you don't have access to the show notes for whatever reason, you can always see those on the website, which is theartofphotography.tv. So anyway, moving along, the subject I want to talk about today is focusing techniques for photographers. And I'm going to go ahead and assume that you guys already know some of the basics. If you're a beginner photographer and you're watching this, I would highly recommend you watch the referenced episodes I'm talking about. I'm going to put one on aperture so you can understand how aperture and depth of field work together. I'm going to assume that you already know that moving forward so we can cover some more ground today and do some new things. So if you haven't, take a minute, pause this, check out that episode, and then you can come back. Or watch it and you'll check it again later if you don't understand something. The other one I want to talk about is I did one called Ninja Focus Moves a while back. And we were talking about creative use of finding a point of focus. And I still firmly believe, as I said in that episode, that you can create a lot of interest in your photos and in your compositions on where you're putting focus, maybe how much of the image is in focus. You can create a lot of contrast that way. Because when you're using aperture to your advantage on this, just to reiterate a little bit, if you're using really wide apertures, so you're shooting with the iris wide open on the camera, you're going to be able to let more light in, and you also get a very shallow depth of field, which means maybe only one little microscopic point or one millimeter, centimeter, or even an inch or whatever you're measuring with becomes in focus in that scene. Whereas if you use a smaller aperture, you let less light in, but you get a wider depth of field. So if you need to shoot a landscape or something where you really want everything in focus, you need to be shooting at smaller apertures. So that's what that episode covers, and I'm not going to cover that here. I think this is really important, and it happens to me sometimes, it happens to all of us, where you're in the heat of the moment, you're working with the camera, and for whatever reason, you end up with a shot on the well, I say the roll with film, or a shot on your card, that's a really good shot compositionally, the light's good, especially if you're shooting people, the mood might be right, but you're having some focusing issues, and it can really tear apart your picture really fast. And I think it's really important to understand a lot of these techniques and to be able to practice these. If there's anything to ever practice when shooting, it's definitely exposure and it's definitely focus. Being able to get what you want, in a very short amount of time, be able to shoot quickly, especially if you're working with people or fast-moving objects like sports or cars or something like that. This is all very important. So what you have to remember that focal planes or focus points, we're dealing with a third dimension. Now, photography is generally displayed, it's a two-dimensional representation of something that's in three dimensions. So you have height and width, but if you're looking at, like, for instance, a photo in a magazine or even online on a computer screen, you're looking at two dimensions, so you don't see depth. It is representing depth. Depth is represented in photographs by what is in focus and what might not be in focus. And so you can create a lot of interest by being able to play with that depth. And we talked about a lot of that in the second show that I'm referencing that I'll put in the show notes on the ninja focus techniques, because I think especially when you get into tilt shift lenses and things like that, you can really start to create a lot of interest by what is in focus and what is not. And also think of it this way, that focus implies some contrast involved. So if you're focusing on an object, you're going to see hard defined lines within whatever that image is that's in focus. Whereas the areas that are out of focus tend to blur together, the lines become softer if they even exist at all, and sometimes if you're really shooting a wide aperture, it can become blobs of color. Focal length plays into this too. If you're using lenses that have longer focal lengths on them, like portrait lenses or telephoto lenses, it's easier to knock out backgrounds. And so, for instance, that's a very common technique you see, especially with portraits. If you shoot a headshot of somebody and you knock the background out of focus, and it creates a nice contrast between their face, which is in focus, you see defined lines, shapes, etc. Whereas you see these out of areas that are kind of buttery and blurred, and sometimes it looks really beautiful. And so that's a common technique to use. That's easier to achieve with a longer focal length, sometimes telephoto or portrait length lens, than it is with a wide angle lens. Wide angle lenses tend to have a wider depth of field to them, and they tend to kind of make everything more in focus than you're going to get with that blur using a longer focal length on your lens. Okay, now having said that, a lot of this is kind of going to be artistic or creative things that you're going to decide as a photographer. What's weird about it is we're tied into, especially if you're using, this is my Canon, if you're using a modern digital camera that has all these focus modes and it's trying to decide for you. It's weird because for me, it's like I don't want the camera to decide what to focus for me. However, this is very essential sometimes, particularly this happens to be a full frame sensor, so I have a little wider viewpoint through the viewfinder than I do on something. I have an older Nikon that I like to shoot on a lot. That is a smaller frame. It's not full frame, so it's like 3/4 or so. And it's really hard because my eyes, I wear eyeglasses, and my eyes aren't good enough to be able to focus manually through that small viewfinder. So anyway, so what are some of the techniques that you can do that will help you with that? And I think this is really important. I will say this too, you're going to have to get your camera manual out because I'm not going to be able to cover the terminology as it applies to every camera in this short video, but I do want to apply conceptually what a lot of modern cameras will do. A lot of times, and it varies what this is called camera to camera, but you have basically two shooting modes. There's there's single point focus, autofocus. I'm talking about autofocus modes, not manual. There's single point autofocus, and then there's something called continuous autofocus. Some cameras call this a servo mode. There's different names. And then there's also a more advanced mode than that. That's kind of some of the camera manufacturers call it a dynamic focus. And that's the mode I probably use the least, because what it's doing is it's taking all the focus points that your sensor and your camera are capable of dealing with, and it's going to use a bunch of algorithms and computer stuff to determine what it wants in focus. I really don't like that at all, because the camera is not thinking like I am. It's not connected to me, so there's no way that I'm going to let something that's completely automatic choose that focus point for me, so it's really difficult. So anyway, the big two I'm going to talk about, and like I said, look at your camera manual. If you've lost your manual, look it up online. They're usually there. But the big ones I'm going to talk about are single point focus and continuous. And then there's another thing that you can deal with on any camera, and it's a focus lock. You can do focus locks and you can do exposure locks. And a lot of this is going to come down to, because especially if you're on a small frame sensor, my eye is not going to be able to pick up exactly whether that's in focus. The camera's going to have to do that for me, but I need to be able to tell the camera what it is that I want in focus. Now, with single point autofocus, one of the things you can do, and this is a mistake you see people making a lot, and I used to do it a lot myself, is where you set that point, and there are ways to set the points, you can do it with the dials on the back of the camera, to be in the center of the frame. And what I'll do is a technique, and this is really not something you want to do, which is basically to figure out what the focus is, lock it, and then recompose. And I'll tell you why this is hard. It may work in some small instances, but in general, what's going to happen is focal planes are basically parallel to the camera. So for instance, if I'm focusing on the camera, and then what I want to do is move it over this way, especially if I'm on a wide angle or something like that, a lot of times what I can do, because I've turned this, it knocked that focal plane out, so I may be slightly out of focus, and there is nothing more devastating than getting a great shot and having it only slightly out of focus. There's no way you can really sharpen it, anything like that. So it's really a good idea to understand how to change that point from the center of the lens or the view. Now, depending on what kind of camera you have, more expensive cameras generally have more autofocus points. Cheaper cameras generally have less. So what you want to do is get that as close as possible. I think it's okay to focus and recompose just a little bit. For instance, I have an older Nikon D40. It only has 3 areas when I'm selecting, and what I'll do is I'll select the area that's close enough to what I'm wanting to do, and then I'll go for it. But you want to understand how to use the focus lock, and you want to understand how to change that focus point and do it quickly. Depending on what you're shooting, that can have a big difference on it too. So if you're shooting something like sports, which we'll talk about with continuous focus, it can be very split second, or if you're shooting street photos, as opposed to doing maybe a portrait session or something where people aren't moving around as much and you can shoot and recompose and check things. But either way, you don't want to get in a situation, particularly if you're doing a portrait with a model where it's a sitting session, where you're messing around trying to get something in focus. You have bigger things to think about. You want to be creative as a photographer. You're wondering about your composition, especially if you're working with people, capturing a mood and emotion from them. And focus is it needs to be second nature. That's not what you want to be thinking about at that point in time. It's just like exposure. Those need to be second nature. You need to be able to do minimal fooling around with that to get what you want. So this is a good thing to practice. And sometimes maybe just take your camera, go outside and shoot, and try to envision within the scene what do I want in focus, and do it quickly. And understand how your camera works and use those techniques, because it is kind of difficult. I mean, the wonderful thing about DSLRs and a lot of these modern digital cameras is they have all these tools and these methods of using those tools built into their systems and their computers that help us, but you have to learn how to use them, and that's really, really important. So anyway, so we've come getting off track, but we covered single point autofocus. The other one is continuous autofocus, and basically what this will do is it allows you to take a point in the scene. Again, you're going to use it with a point selector, and when you hit the focus lock, it will lock whatever that one object is in focus. And so what's nice about that is if you're shooting sports or something where somebody's moving, the camera in this servo mode or continuous mode will continue to readjust the focus and follow that object. So for instance, if you're shooting a car coming towards you, it's going to go out of the focal path really soon. So you need to be able to lock that in with a continuous focus and allow that to refocus as it comes in until you take the shot. It's not always perfect. Better cameras, obviously more expensive cameras do this better than cheaper cameras, but don't feel like you got to go out there and spend a bunch of money on a camera. Most of you who have watched this show in the past understand that I am totally into learn to use the equipment you have, whatever that is. Don't feel like going out and buying something new is going to be the answer to it. I mean, that's kind of fun and it's therapeutic, and gear acquisition syndrome and all that. I mean, that's fine. But are you into collecting cameras, or are you into becoming a better photographer? And I'm not going to stand on a high horse and say that, because there have been times in my life, particularly with like toy cameras and junk cameras and stuff, where I bought a lot of them. But learn to use the equipment you have. That's what's going to make you a better photographer. And if you have limitations to that equipment, if you have a lower line DSLR or something like that only has 3 autofocus points, well, learn how to use that, and learn how to understand that, and learn how to read your camera manual and figure that out. So anyway, all that to say, so those are the 2 modes that I concern myself mostly with. I'd say 90-95% of the time for the stuff that I shoot, I stay in single focus mode, and then if something is moving or something, there are rare times where I will fold into that mode. But understand how to use the autofocus lock too, because what you want to be able to do is lock that in. What you don't want to do is be able to focus on something and then maybe you move, or the subject moves or something like that, and then you take the picture and the focus is changed. Or sometimes, depending on what mode you're in, the camera won't let you take the picture until it's recomposed in focus. And so those are things to think about. So understanding how to use focus lock and understanding those 2 modes, they will get you a long way. I also want to talk about older cameras before we wrap up today, because I know a lot of you shoot film. I shoot a lot of film. And one thing that I've noticed, if you have shot on both modern digital cameras and also older film SLRs, there's a huge difference in the viewpoint the viewfinder and the magnification of that. For instance, I really like to shoot. I've got an old Canon that I shoot on, an A1. I've got an F3. I've got an F4, and I use those a lot for 35 millimeter. And one of the things that I love about it is the magnification in the viewfinder is such that I can actually use manual focus in those. So that can help. But again, you need to practice on that. And it's really important to understand what in your composition is going to make it interesting when you create that as a focal point. And I guess some of the things that I'm saying on this too, and let's talk about that creative side for just a second. Some of those things depend on a lot of factors. If you're shooting with a wide angle, obviously it's harder to create depth of field and create blurred backgrounds and such. And you know, so using a telephoto, longer focal length. Another thing you can do is if you're using tilt shift lenses, or if you're using a large format 4x5, you can actually use tilt shift to throw those planes of focus out, and you can really start to blur things out and create definite centers of attention with focus on those. You know, there's no right or wrong answer to what should be in focus. And it's funny because the more of these shows that I've done, the less I'm interested in like telling you, here's what you want to remember. I know that some of you may feel better learning that depending on what your skill level is. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think you need to be able to learn to decide for yourself what creates something that's interesting or what creates something that works. I think as a general rule of thumb, you can easily say that if you have distracting objects in a foreground that are not in focus, so if you're taking my portrait right now and there's books in the foreground, they're blurred, they can be really distracting. So generally foreground objects are harder to work with. It doesn't mean in every situation it wouldn't work. In fact, if you go look at that other episode where I talk about ninja focus moves, there are some really interesting examples that I found by other photographers in there. There's a Dan Winters shot where he has something in the foreground that's completely blurred out and something in the background's in focus. There's a really nice shot too, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Keith Carter, who's a very, very good photographer from Texas, one of my favorites. I think he's probably one of easily the top 10 photographers shooting today in the fine art world. And he has this beautiful picture that he shot. It's a black and white photo of two boys in a swamp, and they're collecting fireflies in a jar. What's interesting is his use of focus in that shot, and he uses tilt shift lenses, so he's got a wide range of blur going on. The one thing that's in focus is this magnolia leaf. The boys in this jar of fireflies are actually out of focus, and it works, and it's beautiful. I'll put a link in the show notes. Check Keith out. He is amazing. He's one of my favorites. I haven't talked about him a lot on the show, and I plan to change that in the near future. Anyway, but the magnolia leaf being in focus, and I remember reading an interview with him where he said that was important to suggest this magnolia leaf being regional and this being in Texas somewhere on a lake. And I thought that's a really interesting thing. It's something that maybe a viewer wouldn't pick up on unless they were from Texas or had been to Texas and understood that. But for me, being from Texas, that really was kind of cool. But it was interesting because what was in focus wasn't necessarily the point of interest in the photograph. So there are techniques and things that you can do. It's all about understanding how focus works, how to get the results that you want with your camera, and how to start making judgment calls on these things. And I think this may be worth talking about again, maybe next week or in a future episode, is, you know, how using, like I said, focal points define that third dimension in a photo. A photo itself is two-dimensional. It's flat. It's on a piece of paper. It's on a computer screen, or it's on a wall, or whatever it is. It's on a poster. And you're creating that third dimension, and that's how we do it in photography, is with light and mainly with what is in focus and what is not. So that can be really interesting to deal with too. So anyway, all these things to say, I think this is worth reading up on. I think it's worth a couple things that I can give you to kind of work on your own to practice with. First of all, take your camera, get out, get your manual, learn what the focus modes are. I tend to rely on the single point focus mode a lot, and then continuous as a secondary. Learn them both. Practice, use them both. Do that when you're not, you know, in the heat of the moment on something that's really of importance to you, like whether that's a paid job or whether that's a portrait setting or whether it's a fine art photo you're trying to make. Those need to be second nature when you're doing those. Those need to be ingrained in you. It's kind of like in music. It's like pianists aren't like running scales on a gig. They're playing music. They know the scales and they know the arpeggios and all that so ingrained in their brain that they just move right on and they're able to concentrate on things that make them deeper as a musician. Same for you as a photographer. You need to concentrate on things that are going to make you deeper as a photographer, and you don't want to have missing links in things that should be second nature, like focusing. So that's one thing I would do. The second thing I would do, and I think this is equally important, if not maybe a little bit more important, is go find photographers that are doing this kind of thing and doing the kind of work that you want to maybe not copy, I don't recommend that, but whose work you want to influence you, and look at how they're answering some of these artistic questions. Keith Carter, I've mentioned before, fabulous photographer, and he does a lot of really interesting things with focal techniques. There are others. I mentioned Sugimoto a lot on here. There's some wonderful photos he's made of architectural works that are entirely blurred, but there's an interest to them. And so the interest isn't always in the focal point, but it is important to where that focal point is in the composition that you're shooting. I'll mention some others too. And then you have left guard, people like, Ernst Haas, who, I'll put a link again in the show notes, another brilliant photographer who shoots a lot of things that are perfectly in focus, but then he creates the blur with motion with the subject. So for instance, I'm thinking of right now, there's a really beautiful set of photos he did of the landscapes with horses in them. Landscapes are perfectly in focus and the horses are blurred, but they're not blurred with where the focal point is. They're using really small apertures. They're blurred because they're moving. So he does it with shutter speed. So it's kind of weird. I was talking with a friend of mine the other day, and if you've ever read the book Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, and the answer is 42. 42 is the answer to everything. It's the answer to the meaning of life, but nobody knows what the question is. And so art is a lot like that too. And I think it's really important for us as artists to try to find questions to those answers sometimes. Okay, we know that something needs to be in focus, and we know that's creating interest within our composition. It's either blurry or it's perfectly in focus and you see contrast with lines and what have you. And so how do you arrive at that, and what is it that you're going for? We don't always get it right. I think that learning process is failing sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with that. Anyway, some focus techniques, and I hope I didn't get too heady on you there at the end. Like I said, if you want to get really specific with this stuff, I'm going to link in the show notes to the aperture episode we did, which is perfectly, or purely a technical episode, which talks about aperture and depth of field. And then I would talk about the Ninja, or I would also go review the Ninja focus moves, because I show some work in there by other artists too that I think are really good examples of some of these techniques that we're talking about. So really, guys, remember, this needs to be second nature. Consult your camera manual, understand your focus modes, practice them. Let me know if you have any questions. Leave comments, send emails, leave tweets, whatever it is you want to do, and maybe we can clear up any confusion next time around. So anyway, everybody, thanks again for watching. Once again, this has been The Art of Photography, and I will see you next time.